At 81 years old, sitting here on my porch with the Missouri evening mist rolling in like memories I can't shake, I gotta tell y'all something that's been eating at my soul for over 60 years now. My husband used me 7 times a day, every single day, and I thought it was about his hunger for me. But Lord help me, it was something so much sicker than I ever imagined. My name is Fate Hayes, and if you drove through Sparrow Creek tomorrow morning, you'd see me watering my prize-winning roses, the same ones that got me first place at the county fair 3 years running. Folks here know me as the quiet widow who makes the best apple butter in 3 counties, the woman who never misses Sunday service and always sits in the 3rd pew from the front, left side. They see my clean house, my pressed dresses, the way I wave from my garden when they pass by. They think they know me. But this town with its church bells chiming every hour and the sweet smell of honeysuckle climbing my fence posts, it's been keeping my secret for longer than some of these people been alive. The sound of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, the gentle chatter from the diner downtown, even the way the evening light filters through my lace curtains. It all feels like a lie now, like I've been living in a costume that don't fit right. Because underneath all this normal, underneath this life I built from the ashes of what happened, there's a truth so dark it would make these good Christian folks cross the street when they see me coming. I made myself a promise when I woke up this morning, listening to that same mockingbird that's been singing outside my window for the past 5 springs. I promised I'd finally tell the whole story, the real story, not the sanitized version I've been carrying around like a stone in my chest. Because there comes a time when keeping quiet ain't protecting nobody anymore. It's just protecting the lie. And here's what I need from you. Whoever's listening to this old woman's confession, I need you to stay with me through the ugly parts, through the parts that's gonna make you want to turn away. Because this ain't just my story anymore. This is the story of what happens when evil wears the face of a husband, when a 17-year-old girl gets sold to pay debts, and when silence becomes its own kind of prison. If you got the stomach for the truth, if you can handle hearing about the real hunger that lived in my house, then pull up a chair and listen close, because I'm about to tell you how I survived hell, and why it took me 64 years to understand what was really happening to me in that bed, with the scratchy sheets and the smell of old wood that still haunts my dreams. You gotta understand something about 1942 in Missouri. Times were harder than old leather. And when your daddy gets the consumption and can't work the fields no more, well, there ain't many choices for a family like ours. We had 17 acres of good farmland, but good land don't mean nothing when there's no seed money and the bank man comes knocking every other week with his papers and his cold eyes. I was 17 that spring, just turned in March when the dogwoods started blooming, and I thought I knew what my life was gonna look like. I figured I'd marry Tommy Brennan from down the road, the boy with the crooked smile who used to leave wildflowers on our porch step. I had dreams, you know. Simple dreams about Sunday dinners and babies crawling around on clean floors and maybe even a little vegetable garden behind a white house with blue shutters. But dreams don't pay debts, and when Daddy started coughing up blood, something fierce, Mama sat me down at our kitchen table, that old oak table that wobbled on one leg, and told me about the offer that come from Abner Finch. Now, Abner owned near half the county, had money that went back 3 generations, and at 60 years old, he was looking for his 3rd wife. His second one, Genevieve, had died in childbirth just 2 years prior, and folks said he was getting lonely up in that big house on the hill. He's offering to pay off the farm debt and give your daddy the medicine he needs, Mama said, her hands shaking as she poured the chicory coffee that was all we could afford. All he wants in return is for you to be his wife. I remember the way the late afternoon sun was slanting through our kitchen window, making everything look golden and peaceful, while my whole world was crashing down around my ears. Marriage to Abner Finch meant security, meant Daddy might live, meant my younger brother could finish school instead of working the fields till his hands bled. It also meant saying goodbye to every dream I'd ever had about love. But here's what nobody told me, what I wouldn't understand until I was already trapped in that house with its heavy curtains and rooms that always smelled like pipe tobacco and something else I couldn't name, something sweet and sour at the same time, like flowers left too long in a vase. Nobody warned me that Abner's hunger wasn't the normal kind of wanting that happens between a man and wife. Nobody prepared me for the way his eyes would look right through me, like I was just a ghost wearing the shape of someone else. The wedding was small, just immediate family and a few neighbors, held right there in our front parlor with Pastor Williams reading from his worn Bible. I wore Mama's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and let out in the bust, and I remember thinking how the lace felt scratchy against my neck, like it was trying to choke me even then. Abner stood beside me in his best black suit, smelling of bay rum and something medicinal, and when he slipped that gold band on my finger, his hands were cold as January morning. That first night, when he led me up the stairs to what was now our bedroom, I thought I was ready. Mama had given me the talk that morning, all stuttered words and red cheeks, about a wife's duties and how it might hurt at first but would get easier. What she didn't prepare me for was the ritual of it. The way Abner would pull out his pocket watch and check the time like he was timing a horse race. The way he'd fold his clothes just so on the chair by the window, never looking at me while I changed into the nightgown he'd laid out on the bed. A nightgown that belonged to Genevieve, still smelling faintly of her lavender water. 7 times that first day, 7 times he called me to that room with its heavy burgundy curtains and the bed that creaked like it was crying. Morning, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, evening, night, and once more before dawn. Each time the same, methodical, silent, his eyes fixed on something over my shoulder like he was seeing someone who wasn't there. I told myself it was just how marriage was, that maybe older men had different needs, that I'd adjust. But there was something in his touch that felt angry, something in the way he'd grip my shoulders that spoke of punishment instead of passion. And when it was over, when he'd roll away from me and immediately start getting dressed, I'd lie there listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time until he'd be back again, and I'd wonder what kind of hunger needs feeding 7 times a day and never seems satisfied. The other wives in town, when I'd see them at the general store or after church service, they'd give me these knowing looks, like they were sharing some secret joke about newlyweds and honeymoon periods. But this wasn't fading, wasn't gentling into something normal and comfortable. If anything, Abner's need seemed to be growing stronger, more desperate, like he was trying to fill a hole that just kept getting deeper. And that's when I started to suspect that maybe I wasn't his wife at all, but something else entirely, something I didn't have a name for yet, something that made my skin crawl even when he wasn't touching me. But I had no idea, sitting there in that big house with its polished floors and heavy furniture, that what I was experiencing wasn't desire at all. It was revenge, and the person he was really punishing wasn't even alive anymore. Living with Abner was like sharing a house with a thunderstorm that never quite breaks. All that heavy pressure in the air, waiting for lightning to strike. The man I married wasn't cruel in the ways you might expect. He never raised his voice, never laid a hand on me in anger. He provided well, made sure I had nice dresses for church and enough money for groceries. To the outside world, we looked like any other married couple walking down Main Street on Sunday mornings. But inside that house, I was learning the difference between a husband and a keeper. Abner had routines that governed every minute of our days, schedules more precise than the train that came through Sparrow Creek at 2:15 every afternoon. He'd wake at 5:30 sharp, dress in the same order every day: underwear, undershirt, trousers, shirt, suspenders. And then he'd turn to me with those winter sky eyes and say, "Time, fate." Just those 2 words, like I was an appointment on his calendar. The house itself felt like it was holding its breath. Everything spotless, everything in its place, heavy drapes keeping out too much sunlight, making the rooms feel dim, even at midday. I'd dust the same mahogany furniture every morning, polish the same silver frames holding pictures of people I didn't know, sweep floors that never seemed to get dirty. The silence was so thick you could almost touch it, broken only by the tick of that grandfather clock and Abner's measured footsteps moving from room to room like he was patrolling something. He'd go about his business, managing his farms, checking on his tenants, handling money matters in his study. And I'd go about mine, which mostly involved waiting for the next time he'd appear in whatever room I was in and say those 2 words. Waiting for meals we'd eat in silence while he read his agricultural newspapers. waiting for bedtime when he'd blow out the lamp and turn away from me like I wasn't even there. The strangest part was how he'd look at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't watching. Not with desire or even fondness, but with this calculating expression, like he was measuring something about me against something in his mind, like I was failing some test I didn't even know I was taking. I started talking to myself just to hear a human voice in that quiet house, started humming hymns while I worked just to push back against the silence. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the hall mirror and barely recognize the girl staring back. Thin as a fence post, eyes too big for my face, always looking startled like a rabbit caught in a field. But it wasn't until I found that loose floorboard in the upstairs closet that I began to understand I wasn't the first woman to live this particular kind of life in Abner Finch's house. It was a Tuesday in late October when I found it. Or maybe it was a Wednesday. My memory gets fuzzy about the exact day, but I remember clear as yesterday that the maple outside our bedroom window had turned the color of dried blood, and there was that first real bite of winter in the air that makes you want to wrap yourself up tight and hide. I was looking for an extra quilt, something to ward off the chill that seemed to live in the bones of that house, no matter how much wood Abner put in the fireplace. The upstairs linen closet was one of the few places in the house that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. Probably because it was just practical shelves and folded fabric, nothing fancy or intimidating. I was reaching up to the highest shelf, standing on my tiptoes, when my hand knocked against something that didn't feel like cloth. The floorboard underneath was loose, warped just enough that when I pressed down, it gave a little. Now, I wasn't the curious type by nature. Daddy always said curiosity killed more than just cats. But something about that loose board called to me like a whisper in church that you can't quite ignore. Maybe it was the loneliness talking, or maybe it was the way that house made me feel like I was living in someone else's shadow. But I found myself prying at that board with my fingernails until it came up. Underneath was a small space, maybe the size of a cigar box, and inside that space was something wrapped in faded blue cloth that smelled like old roses and dust. My hands were shaking. Lord, I don't know why, but they were shaking something fierce as I unwrapped what turned out to be a leather-bound book, small enough to fit in my palm, with a brass clasp that had turned green with age. The moment I opened it and saw the careful handwriting on the first page, Property of Genevieve Finch, 1940, my heart started beating so loud I was afraid Abner might hear it downstairs in his study. This was her diary, his dead wife's diary, hidden away like some kind of secret treasure. I should have put it back, should have wrapped it up in that blue cloth and pretended I never found it. But sitting there on the closet floor with autumn light filtering through the hallway window, I started reading, and what I found in those pages made my blood run cold as creek water in January. The first entries were normal enough. Talk about the weather, mentions of church socials and visits with neighbors, the kind of everyday things any woman might write about. But as I kept reading, flipping through pages filled with Genevieve's careful script, the tone started changing. She began writing about Abner's peculiar needs, about how he seemed to be punishing her for something she couldn't understand. He looks at me sometimes like I'm someone else, she wrote, like he's seeing a different woman entirely, someone who has wronged him terribly. And the frequency, it's not natural. It's like he's trying to erase something through me, using my body to settle some score I don't even know about. My mouth went dry as I read those words, because they could have been my own thoughts written down on paper. The same confusion, the same creeping fear that what was happening in our bedroom wasn't about love or even desire, but something darker and more twisted. But it was the last entry, dated just 3 days before Genevieve died, that made me understand I was in real danger. Her handwriting was different here, shakier, like she'd been scared while she wrote it. I found the photograph today. I know what he thinks I did, and I know he will never forgive me for it. I'm carrying his child, but he looks at me like I'm carrying someone else's. God help me. I think he means to punish this baby for my supposed sins. I have to get away from here before. The entry just stopped there, mid-sentence, like she'd been interrupted or maybe just couldn't find the words for whatever horrible realization had come to her. And as I sat there in that closet with her diary in my hands, hearing Abner's footsteps moving around downstairs, I finally understood what I was really facing in my marriage. I wasn't Abner Finch's beloved wife. I was Genevieve's replacement in some sick game of revenge he'd been playing long before I ever walked into his house. And if I didn't figure out what he thought she'd done to him, I might end up just as dead as she was. That night, I couldn't sleep for thinking about Genevieve's words, about that photograph she'd mentioned, and what it might mean. Every time Abner's breathing would settle into that deep rhythm that meant he was truly asleep, I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the puzzle of what kind of woman my husband thought he'd married. It was sometime around 3 in the morning. I know because I heard the grandfather clock chime in the hallway. When I made the decision that would change everything. I slipped out of bed quiet as a church mouse and padded barefoot back to that closet, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it would wake the dead. The diary was still there where I'd hidden it under the loose floorboard, but this time I took it with me down to the kitchen where I could light the oil lamp and read properly. What I found in those remaining pages made me understand that Genevieve hadn't just been imagining things. She'd been living the same nightmare I was living, only she'd figured out the why of it before it killed her. The entries from her final months painted a picture of a woman slowly coming apart under the weight of her husband's inexplicable rage and the growing certainty that he believed their unborn child wasn't his. "He counts," she wrote in one entry that made my hands shake. "I've realized he's counting the days, calculating when the baby was conceived, and somehow he's convinced himself it happened during a time when he thinks I was unfaithful. But I was never unfaithful. I never even looked at another man. The only time I was away from the house was when I went to help care for my sick sister in Kansas City for those 3 weeks in May. And he knows that. He drove me to the train station himself. I had to stop reading and put my head in my hands because the horror of it was starting to make sense. Abner wasn't just a man with an unusual appetite for his wife. He was a man who'd convinced himself that his wife had betrayed him. And every single time he took me to that bedroom, he was trying to somehow undo what he believed she'd done. I was paying the price for another woman's imagined sins. But it was the next entry that nearly made me drop the diary altogether. I found where he keeps it, the photograph he thinks proves my guilt. It's in his study, locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. It's a picture of me talking to a man at the train station in Kansas City, just talking, nothing more. But somehow Abner has twisted it into evidence of an affair that never happened. The man was just asking for directions, but in Abner's mind, that moment of conversation has become proof that I'm carrying another man's child. The final entry was just 2 lines, written in handwriting so shaky I could barely make it out. "The baby is coming early. Abner says if it doesn't look like him, he'll know for certain what I am. God help us both." Genevieve had died giving birth to a baby that, according to the town records I'd seen at the courthouse, looked exactly like Abner Finch. She'd died being punished for a betrayal that existed only in her husband's sick imagination. And now I was living in her place, suffering the same punishment for the same imagined crime. Sitting there in that kitchen with the oil lamp flickering and casting dancing shadows on the walls, I finally understood the true horror of my situation. I wasn't just married to a man with peculiar needs. I was married to a man who'd already killed one wife with his paranoid delusions, and now he was slowly killing me the same way. The worst part was the realization that hit me like a physical blow. If Abner could convince himself that Genevieve had been unfaithful based on nothing more than a photograph of her talking to a stranger, what would stop him from finding similar evidence against me? What innocent moment from my past would he twist into proof of betrayal? And what would he do to me when he decided I was just as guilty as he'd convinced himself Genevieve was? I was still sitting there with those terrible questions spinning in my mind when I heard footsteps on the stairs and realized Abner had discovered I wasn't in our bed. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs, and I could feel Abner standing there in the darkness, listening. My whole body went rigid as a fence post, and I had just enough time to blow out the oil lamp and shove Genevieve's diary down the front of my nightgown before I heard him moving toward the kitchen. "Fate?" His voice cut through the dark like a blade, not angry exactly, but with that cold control that somehow felt worse than shouting. "What are you doing down here?" I pressed my back against the kitchen chair, feeling the leather binding of the diary digging into my ribs, and tried to make my voice sound normal. "Couldn't sleep," I managed to whisper. thought maybe some warm milk might help. He appeared in the doorway like a ghost, his white nightshirt making him look pale and otherworldly in the moonlight coming through the window. For a long moment, he just stood there studying me, and I could feel those winter sky eyes cataloging every detail. My bare feet, my trembling hands, the way I was holding myself too stiff and careful. "You're cold," he said finally, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite read. Almost like concern, but twisted somehow, like he was worried about damage to something that belonged to him rather than actual care for my comfort. "Yes," I said, because it was true. I was shaking all over, though not entirely from the chill. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell the bay rum he used on his hair and something else underneath it, something sour and medicinal that seemed to cling to his skin. When he reached out and touched my cheek with the back of his hand, I had to bite my tongue to keep from flinching away. "You remind me of her sometimes," he said, so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "The way you move, the way you hold your head." Genevieve had that same delicate quality. The diary felt like it was burning against my chest, and I wondered if he could somehow sense its presence, if guilt was written across my face in letters big enough for him to read even in the dark. "People always said we favored each other a little," I whispered, which was true. Folks had mentioned it at our wedding, how his second and third wives had that same slight build and dark hair. "Yes," he said, and his hand moved from my cheek to my throat, not squeezing, just resting there like a reminder of how easily he could hurt me if he chose to. "But you're different too. Stronger, maybe. She was always so fragile, always crying about something." The way he said it, like Genevieve's tears had been some kind of personal affront rather than the natural response of a woman being slowly destroyed by her husband's delusions, made my stomach turn. But I just nodded and tried to look like the obedient wife he expected me to be. "Come back to bed," he said, taking my hand in his. "It's late, and tomorrow is going to be a long day." I let him lead me back upstairs, the diary hidden against my body feeling heavier with each step. As we climbed those creaking stairs, I found myself looking at the family portraits hanging in the hallway. Generations of Finch men with their stern faces and pale eyes, and wondering how many other women had walked this same path, carrying secrets that could destroy them if discovered. Back in our bedroom, Abner settled into bed like nothing had happened, but I could feel him watching me as I climbed in beside him. The mattress dipped under his weight, and when he reached for me, pulling me close against his side, I had to concentrate on breathing normally and not thinking about the diary pressed between us. "You know I love you, don't you, Fate?" he whispered against my hair. But there was something hollow in the words, like he was reciting lines from a play he'd memorized but never really understood. "Yes," I whispered back, because what else could I say? But lying there in the dark with his arm around me and Genevieve's secrets burning against my skin, I knew I was living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, Abner would find some innocent moment to twist into evidence of betrayal, just like he had with his second wife. And when that happened, I'd either end up dead like Genevieve, or I'd have to find a way to escape before his paranoid delusions could destroy me too. The question that kept me awake until dawn was whether I was strong enough to save myself, or if I was already too deep in his twisted game to find my way out alive. The next few weeks passed like walking on glass, every step careful, every word measured, knowing that one wrong move could shatter everything. I kept Genevieve's diary hidden in different places around the house, moving it every few days like some kind of dangerous treasure that could explode if discovered. Sometimes I'd tuck it behind the flour canister, other times between the mattresses, always somewhere Abner wouldn't think to look. But hiding the diary was nothing compared to hiding what I'd learned from it. Every time Abner would call me to our bedroom with those two cold words, time, fate, I had to pretend I didn't know what he was really doing, had to lie there while he used my body to punish a dead woman for crimes she'd never committed, had to bite my tongue when he'd whisper her name in the dark, thinking I was asleep. It was during Sunday service, maybe 3 weeks after I'd found the diary, that I noticed Mrs. Clara Whitman watching me with those sharp little eyes of hers. Clara ran the church ladies' auxiliary and had a tongue sharper than her sewing needles, always ready to slice up anyone who didn't meet her standards of proper Christian behavior. After the service, she cornered me by the fellowship hall, Her gray hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. "Fate, honey," she said in that sugary voice she used when she was about to deliver poison. "I've been meaning to ask, you feeling all right? You've been looking peaked lately, thin as a rail." I forced a smile and smoothed my dress, aware that other women were drifting closer to listen. Just adjusting to married life, I suppose, learning to keep house for a man like Mr. Finch. "Oh, we all know about Abner's appetites," Clara said, and the way she said it made my skin crawl. His poor first wife, Margaret, used to complain something fierce about his demands. And then Genevieve, bless her heart, she'd come to church sometimes looking like she'd been through a windstorm. The other women tittered like this was all perfectly normal gossip, but I felt ice forming in my veins. They knew. The whole congregation knew what kind of man Abner was, and they'd just stood by and watched while he destroyed 2 wives before me. "Course Genevieve had other problems too," Clara continued, lowering her voice like she was sharing state secrets. "Toward the end, she was acting real strange. Paranoid, you might say. Going through Abner's things, asking odd questions about his first wife, Margaret. Even went so far as to write letters to Margaret's family back in Illinois, trying to find out why she really died. My blood turned to ice water. Genevieve had been investigating Margaret's death, and now I was the 3rd wife, walking the same dangerous path. What did she find out? I whispered, hardly daring to ask. Clara's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Nothing good, honey. Nothing good at all." Clara's words about Genevieve investigating Margaret haunted me for days after that Sunday service. The idea that Abner's second wife had been digging into his first wife's death opened up possibilities I didn't want to consider, but couldn't stop thinking about either. What if Margaret hadn't died of natural causes like everyone believed? What if Genevieve had discovered something terrible about her predecessor's fate? I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way conversations would stop when I walked into the general store. How some of the older women would look at me with something that might have been pity. The fact that nobody ever talked about Margaret Finch, even though she'd only been dead 8 years. It was like the whole town had agreed to forget she'd ever existed. The worst part was how this new knowledge poisoned everything about my daily life with Abner. When he'd sit across from me at breakfast, methodically buttering his toast and reading his agricultural reports, I'd find myself studying his hands and wondering what they might have done. When he'd check his pocket watch before calling me upstairs, I'd think about how that same calculated precision might have been used for darker purposes. Even his gentleness started feeling sinister, like he was being careful with me the way you'd be careful with something you planned to break later. But it was when I started exploring the house more thoroughly that I found the first real evidence that my fears weren't just paranoia. In the basement, behind the coal bin, where nobody would think to look, I discovered a trunk that had been shoved against the stone foundation wall. The lock was old and rusty, but determined desperation gave me strength I didn't know I had, and I managed to pry it open with a poker from the fireplace upstairs. Inside were things that belonged to Margaret, clothes that smelled like mothballs and old lavender, a pair of delicate gloves, some jewelry that looked expensive, and underneath it all, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely untie the ribbon, but when I finally managed it and started reading, I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. They were love letters, but not from Abner. They were signed by someone named James, and they were full of passionate declarations and promises to take Margaret away from her unhappy marriage. The dates on the letters showed they'd been written during the last months of Margaret's life, and reading them, I could feel the desperation of a woman trapped in an impossible situation, torn between duty and a love she'd never expected to find. The final letter was different from the others. James was begging Margaret to leave with him immediately, saying he'd heard rumors about Abner's first wife, a woman named Sarah who'd supposedly died of a fever, but whose death James seemed to think was suspicious. He wrote about how Margaret needed to get away before she became another mysterious tragedy in the Finch family history. But Margaret never left with James, because Margaret died 2 days after that final letter was written, supposedly of heart failure in her sleep, at 24 years old. A perfectly healthy young woman who'd never had heart troubles in her life. Sitting there in that dank basement with those letters in my lap, I finally understood the full scope of what I'd gotten myself into. I wasn't just Abner's third wife. I was potentially his third victim. The man I'd married to save my family from poverty was a killer who'd perfected his method over 2 previous marriages. He'd driven Genevieve to her grave with psychological torture, convinced her that her own husband believed she was an adulteress carrying another man's child. But Margaret had been different. Margaret had found real love elsewhere, and that had required a more permanent solution. The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified me more than anything I'd ever imagined. Abner didn't just punish his wives for imagined betrayals, he eliminated them when those betrayals became real, or when they got too close to discovering the truth about what had happened to their predecessors. And now here I was, holding evidence that could destroy him, trapped in a house with a man who'd already killed at least twice and wouldn't hesitate to make me his 4th victim if he discovered what I knew. Living with the weight of what I'd discovered was like carrying around a rattlesnake in my chest. Every breath was dangerous, every movement calculated to keep from disturbing the deadly thing coiled inside me. I put Margaret's letters back in that basement trunk, but I couldn't put the knowledge back where it came from. It lived with me now, coloring every interaction with Abner, every meal we shared in silence. Every night I lay beside him, wondering if this would be the night he decided I'd learned too much. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. When Abner would touch my cheek with those pale fingers, I had to stop myself from flinching away, knowing those same hands had probably pressed a pillow over Margaret's face or slipped something deadly into her evening tea. When he'd comment on how much I reminded him of his previous wives, I had to smile and nod instead of screaming that I knew exactly why he chose women who looked alike. It made the killing easier, when we were all just versions of the same disposable thing. But keeping secrets that big started wearing on me in ways I hadn't expected. I began losing weight I couldn't afford to lose, my clothes hanging loose on a frame that was already too thin. My hands developed a tremor that showed up at the worst moments, like when I was serving Abner his coffee and the cup would rattle against the saucer for no reason I could explain. Sleep became something that happened in fragments, broken by nightmares where I was running through endless hallways while footsteps followed behind me, getting closer and closer until I'd wake up gasping. The breaking point came on a Thursday, or maybe it was a Friday. The days had started blending together in my exhaustion, when I was cleaning Abner's study and found his desk drawer standing open. Not the locked bottom drawer where Genevieve had said he kept her photograph, but the middle drawer where he usually stored his business correspondence. Sitting right there on top of a stack of bank papers was an envelope addressed to Dr. Harrison in town. And something about the careful way Abner's handwriting formed the letters made my stomach clench with dread. I knew I shouldn't look. Knew that getting caught reading Abner's private correspondence would be the end of me. But the envelope was already open, just sitting there like it was waiting for someone to discover it. And before I could talk myself out of it, I was unfolding the letter inside. It was a request for a consultation about female hysteria and the medical treatments available for wives who exhibited signs of mental instability. Abner had written a detailed description of symptoms he claimed I was displaying: paranoid behavior, weight loss, nervous tremors, difficulty sleeping, and he was asking the doctor about the possibility of having me committed to the state asylum for my own safety and the safety of others. The letter was dated 2 days ago, which meant Abner had already decided I was becoming a problem that needed to be solved. He wasn't going to kill me like he'd killed Margaret, and he wasn't going to drive me to my grave with psychological torture like he'd done with Genevieve. He was going to have me declared insane and locked away where nobody would ever believe anything I said about him. It was brilliant, really, in its calculated cruelty. A woman who'd been committed for hysteria could say anything she wanted about her husband, and the world would just nod sadly and comment on how mental illness could make people believe the most outrageous things. Even if I tried to tell someone about Margaret's love letters or Genevieve's diary, they'd just see the ravings of a woman whose mind had snapped under the pressure of marriage to an older man. Standing there in his study with that letter shaking in my hands, I finally understood that I was completely alone in this nightmare. The town would never believe me over Abner Finch, the respected landowner who'd already suffered through the tragic loss of 2 wives and was now dealing with the heartbreak of a 3rd wife losing her mind. The church ladies who whispered about his appetites would never imagine he was capable of murder. They'd just feel sorry for him having such terrible luck with unstable women. But as I folded that letter and placed it carefully back in the drawer, exactly as I'd found it, one thought kept echoing in my mind with crystal clarity. If Abner thought he could have me declared insane and locked away, he'd made his first real mistake. Because unlike his previous wives, I now knew exactly what kind of monster I was married to, and I still had time to do something about it. The question was whether I had the courage to fight back, or if I'd let him destroy me just like he'd destroyed Margaret and Genevieve. That night, I lay awake, listening to Abner's breathing and planning my escape with the desperate focus of a woman who knows her life depends on getting every detail right. I had maybe a week, 2 at the most, before Dr. Harrison would examine me and sign whatever papers Abner needed to have me committed. After that, I'd disappear into that asylum like smoke, and nobody would ever question what happened to Fate Hayes, the poor, unstable girl who couldn't handle being married to such a fine, patient man. But escaping wasn't just about running away. It was about making sure I could never be found and dragged back to face whatever punishment Abner had planned for a wife who'd discovered his secrets. I needed money, which meant getting into that locked desk drawer, where I suspected he kept more than just Genevieve's photograph. I needed transportation, which would be tricky since Abner controlled the car and knew everyone in town who might give a young woman a ride. Most importantly, I needed evidence that would protect me if he tried to track me down. Something so damning that he'd be more afraid of me exposing him than angry about me leaving. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. Saturday morning, Abner announced he'd be riding out to check on his tenant farmers, something that usually took him most of the day since his properties were scattered across 3 counties. After he left, I watched from the kitchen window until his black Ford disappeared around the bend in the road. And then I ran upstairs to get the sewing scissors from my mending basket. Breaking into that locked desk drawer felt like the most dangerous thing I'd ever done. More terrifying than the first time Abner had called me to our bedroom, or the night I'd found Genevieve's diary. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the scissors steady, and every little sound made me freeze and listen for the rumble of his car returning. But desperation gave me strength, and after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard the lock give way with a soft click. Inside was a collection of horrors that confirmed every terrible suspicion I'd developed about my husband. There was Genevieve's photograph, just like she'd written about. A perfectly innocent picture of her talking to a stranger at a train station, but with angry notes scrawled in Abner's handwriting around the edges, calling her a whore and worse things I won't repeat. There were newspaper clippings about Margaret's sudden death and about Sarah before her, and about a woman named Ruth who'd apparently been his first wife, dead at 19 from what the paper called a tragic accident. But it was the small leather journal hidden at the very back of the drawer that made me understand the full scope of Abner's madness. It was his diary, and reading it was like looking directly into the mind of the devil himself. Entry after entry detailing his suspicions about each wife, his growing certainty that they were all unfaithful, his careful plans for how to eliminate them when their supposed betrayals became unbearable. The entry about Margaret was the worst, a cold, clinical description of how he'd suffocated her with a pillow while she slept, how he'd arranged her body to look peaceful, how he'd practiced looking grief-stricken in the mirror before calling the doctor the next morning. There were similar entries about Ruth and Sarah, each death disguised as accident or illness, each murder justified in Abner's twisted mind as righteous punishment for imaginary sins. The most recent entry was about me, dated just 3 days ago. Fate is showing signs of the same moral weakness as the others. I've seen her going through things that don't concern her, asking questions she has no business asking. The asylum will be a mercy compared to what she deserves for her obvious preparations to betray me like all the rest. Sitting there with his journal in my hands, I finally understood that I wasn't just married to a killer. I was married to a madman who saw betrayal everywhere he looked, who'd convinced himself that murdering 4 wives was not only justified, but necessary. And worse, I realized that my careful snooping hadn't been as secret as I'd thought. He'd been watching me, cataloging my suspicious behavior, building a case against me just like he'd done with all the others. But unlike his previous wives, I now had the evidence to destroy him completely. His journal contained detailed confessions to 4 murders, written in his own hand, with dates and methods and justifications that would horrify any jury in the country. If I could get it to the right authorities, Abner Finch would hang for what he'd done. The problem was getting away alive long enough to make sure justice was served, because as I heard the distant rumble of his Ford coming up the road, I knew my time had run out. Abner was coming home early, and I was sitting in his study with his greatest secret spread out across his desk like evidence in a courtroom. The sound of that Ford's engine getting closer sent pure terror shooting through my veins like ice water. I had maybe 2 minutes before Abner walked through the front door. And here I was sitting in his study with his murder diary open in my hands and his desk drawer broken like a crime scene. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was spinning so fast I couldn't think straight. I shoved his journal inside my dress, grabbed Genevieve's photograph and Margaret's letters from the drawer, and tried to make the broken lock look like it hadn't been tampered with. But my hands were shaking so violently I dropped the scissors, and they clattered across the hardwood floor just as I heard Abner's footsteps on the front porch. There was no time to run, no time to hide the evidence of what I'd discovered. All I could do was smooth down my skirts, try to control my breathing, and pray that somehow I could convince him I'd been doing something innocent, like dusting his study furniture. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and I heard him calling my name in that controlled voice he always used, the one that sounded polite but had ice running underneath it. When he appeared in the doorway of his study, still wearing his hat and coat from his ride, I was standing by the window, pretending to water the plant on the sill. But the moment I saw his face, I knew my performance wasn't fooling anyone. Those winter sky eyes went straight to his desk, took in the broken drawer, the scattered papers, and then fixed on me with an expression that made my blood freeze in my veins. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there studying me like I was some kind of specimen he was trying to identify. Then he slowly removed his hat and coat, hanging them on the rack by the door with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. When he spoke, his voice was so calm, it was more terrifying than screaming would have been. He asked what I'd been doing in his study, and I tried to tell him I'd just been cleaning, that I'd accidentally knocked something over while dusting. But my voice came out as barely a whisper, and I could feel his journal burning against my ribs where I'd hidden it. He walked over to his desk, examined the broken lock, and then turned back to me with something that might have been disappointment if it hadn't been so cold. That's when he told me he'd suspected for weeks that I was becoming just like the others, paranoid, suspicious, going through his private things and looking for evidence of infidelities that existed only in my diseased mind. He said it sadly, like he was genuinely sorry to see me following the same path as Genevieve and Margaret and all the rest. He even reached out to touch my cheek in what would have looked like a gesture of comfort if I hadn't known what those hands were capable of. But then his expression changed, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just the cold control he usually showed, but actual rage, the kind of fury that had been building up behind his careful facade for years and was finally breaking through. He grabbed my shoulders, and his grip was strong enough to leave bruises, strong enough to let me know that the time for pretending was over. He told me he knew what I'd found, knew what I'd read, and that it didn't matter because nobody would ever believe a word I said. He described in detail how he was going to have me committed to the asylum, how the doctors there had special treatments for women who suffered from hysterical delusions, how I'd spend the rest of my short life in a padded room screaming accusations that would only prove how insane I really was. But as he was talking, describing his plans for my destruction with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else, I felt something change inside me. Maybe it was knowing that I had his journal pressed against my heart, physical proof of every horrible thing he'd done. Maybe it was thinking about Margaret and Genevieve and all the other women who died because they hadn't fought back. Or maybe it was just that after months of living in fear, I'd finally reached the point where anger was stronger than terror. When he finished explaining how my life was going to end, I looked him straight in those pale eyes and told him I knew exactly what kind of monster he was. I told him about his journal, about the detailed confessions he'd written in his own hand, about how the whole world was going to know what Abner Finch had done to 4 innocent women who'd made the mistake of trusting him. The look on his face when I said that was something I'll never forget. Pure shock. like he couldn't believe one of his victims had finally found the courage to fight back. But the shock only lasted a moment before it turned into something much more dangerous, and I knew that whatever happened next would determine whether I lived to see another sunrise or became the fifth entry in his murder diary. What happened next still gives me chills when I think about it, even after all these years. Abner's face went through a transformation that was like watching a mask slip off to reveal something inhuman underneath. But instead of lunging for me like I expected, he started laughing, a sound so cold and empty it made my skin crawl worse than his anger had. That's when he told me the truth that changed everything I thought I understood about my situation. He said I was right about him being a killer, right about Margaret and Genevieve and the others, but wrong about one crucial detail that would make all my evidence worthless. He walked over to his desk, pulled out a different key, and opened a secret compartment I hadn't even known existed. Inside was another journal, this one bound in black leather and locked with a brass clasp. When he opened it, I could see pages and pages of handwriting, but it wasn't his careful script. It was someone else's entirely, someone whose penmanship was educated and precise in a way Abner's had never been. He told me the journal I'd stolen from his desk was a fake, planted there for me to find just like he'd planted Genevieve's diary in that loose floorboard upstairs. Every detail about his supposed murders, every confession I thought would destroy him, had been carefully written to convince me I was married to a killer when the truth was something far more twisted and dangerous. The real journal belonged to Dr. Harrison, the same man Abner had written to about having me committed. But Dr. Harrison wasn't just the town physician. He was Abner's partner in a scheme that had been going on for years, targeting young women from poor families who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared. The asylum wasn't a place where inconvenient wives were locked away. It was where they were taken to die, their deaths recorded as suicides or accidents, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. Abner had never killed anyone himself. He was just the recruiter, the respectable widower who married desperate girls and then drove them to madness with psychological torture until they were ready to be handed over to Dr. Harrison for the final phase of their destruction. The 7 times a day, the coldness, the constant sense of being watched and judged. It was all designed to break down my sanity until I was genuinely unstable enough that nobody would question my commitment. But here's the part that nearly stopped my heart. Margaret and Genevieve, and all the others, hadn't died. They were still alive, locked away in a private section of the asylum that Dr. Harrison ran like his own personal prison, drugged into compliance and forgotten by a world that thought they were dead. I wasn't just facing my own death. I was facing the possibility of spending the rest of my life as a living ghost, trapped with the other women who'd made the mistake of marrying Abner Finch. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, but it also gave me something I hadn't had before: hope. If the other wives were still alive, then there was a chance to save not just myself, but all of them. And if Dr. Harrison was the real monster in this partnership, then Abner was just a coward hiding behind someone else's evil. That's when I made the decision that saved my life and the lives of 5 other women. Instead of trying to run or fight, I told Abner I wanted to make a deal. I said I'd go willingly to the asylum if he'd let me write a letter to my family explaining my decision, something that would make my commitment look voluntary and protect him from suspicion. What I actually wrote was a detailed account of everything I'd discovered, including the location of Dr. Harrison's private ward and the names of all the women I suspected were being held there. I sealed it in an envelope addressed to my brother, but instead of giving it to Abner to mail, I slipped it to Mrs. Clara Whitman at church the next Sunday, telling her it contained my last will and testament and asking her to make sure it reached my family if anything happened to me. Clara might have been a gossip and a busybody, but she wasn't stupid, and she could read between the lines well enough to understand that something was very wrong. 3 days later, when Abner tried to have me committed, Clara had already contacted the state authorities and demanded an investigation into Dr. Harrison's asylum. What they found there was worse than anything I'd imagined. Not just the 5 women who were supposed to be dead, but dozens of others from all over the state, women whose families had been told they'd died of various illnesses when they'd actually been kidnapped and imprisoned. Dr. Harrison had been running his operation for over a decade, and Abner was just one of several men helping him acquire victims. The trial made headlines across Missouri and beyond. Abner got life in prison, Dr. Harrison got the electric chair, and I got something I'd never expected to have again: my freedom and my life back. But more importantly, I got the chance to help rebuild the lives of women who'd been written off as dead, starting with Margaret and Genevieve, who became like sisters to me in the years that followed. I learned that healing takes time, that nightmares don't disappear just because the monster gets locked away, but that surviving something that should have destroyed you makes you stronger than you ever imagined you could be. I'm 81 years old now, and I've spent the last 60 years of my life proving that a woman can not only survive the worst kind of evil, but can thrive in spite of it. If you're listening to this and you're trapped in your own nightmare, remember that even when everything seems hopeless, even when the whole world seems against you, there's always a way out if you're brave enough to look for it. Don't let anyone convince you that you're crazy for seeing the truth. And don't let fear keep you from fighting back when your life depends on it. My story shows that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who can hurt us the worst. But it also shows that the human spirit is stronger than any evil that tries to break it. I'm still here. I'm still fighting. And I want to hear from you. Share your story if you feel called to, because every voice matters, and every survivor makes the world a little bit safer for the women who come after us. Tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know how far my words are traveling and whose lives they might be touching. And if this old woman's story moved you, please subscribe to my channel because I've got more stories to tell. And together we can make sure that women like Margaret and Genevieve and all the others are never forgotten again.